Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, the land we now call the United States was home to thriving civilizations. One of the most remarkable was Cahokia, a sprawling city that stood near what is today St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak around 1050 to 1200 AD, Cahokia was larger than London at the time, with an estimated population of 10 to 20,000 people. The city was built around enormous earthen mounds, the largest of which, Monk's Mound, still stands today. Rising nearly 100 feet high and covering 14 acres at its base, this massive structure required millions of baskets of earth carried by hand over many generations. These mounds served as platforms for temples, homes for leaders, and centers of ceremony. Walking through Cahokia in its prime, you would have seen a bustling metropolis with wooden palisades, a grand plaza, and thousands of homes arranged in careful neighborhoods. The people who built this city understood astronomy, engineering, and urban planning in ways that continue to impress archaeologists today. They tracked the seasons with wooden posts arranged in circles, similar to Stonehenge, allowing them to mark solstices and equinoxes with precision. The city sat at the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, making it a natural hub for trade. Goods from across the continent flowed through Cahokia, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians. The residents played a game similar to lacrosse in the Great Plaza, held elaborate feasts, and created intricate artwork. When the city was eventually abandoned around 1350, possibly due to environmental changes, resource depletion, or social upheaval, it left behind a legacy that challenges our assumptions about pre-Columbian North America. When European explorers finally did arrive, they established settlements along the coasts and rivers of this vast continent. The oldest continuously inhabited city, founded by Europeans in what is now the United States, is St. Augustine, Florida. Founded by Spanish Admiral Pedro Menéndez de Avilés in 1565, St. Augustine predates Jamestown by more than 40 years. The Spanish built a fortress there called the Castillo de San Marcos, constructed from coquina, a unique stone made from compressed seashells that could actually absorb cannonballs rather than shatter under their impact. This remarkable fortress has never been taken by force, withstanding sieges by the British and pirates over centuries. Walking the narrow streets of St. Augustine today, you can still feel the presence of those early Spanish settlers, with buildings that have stood for centuries and stories that stretch back nearly 500 years. The city has flown 5 different flags over its long history, belonging at various times to Spain, Britain, a brief period of patriots during Revolution, the Confederacy, and finally the United States. The Spanish brought with them their language, their Catholic faith, and their architectural style, with homes built around courtyards and streets designed to catch the ocean breeze. They also brought horses, cattle, and pigs to North America, animals that would transform the landscape and the lives of native peoples across the continent. St. Augustine served as a military outpost, protecting Spanish shipping lanes and claiming territory for the Spanish crown, a foothold in the New World that would influence the development of Florida for generations. Not every early settlement survived, however. One of the most haunting mysteries in American history is the lost colony of Roanoke. In the 1580s, English settlers established a colony on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The venture was led by Sir Walter Raleigh, though he himself never visited the colony. In 1587, about 115 colonists, including women and children, arrived on the island under the leadership of John White. White's daughter Eleanor gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. Shortly after, John White returned to England to gather more supplies, but his return was delayed by the Anglo-Spanish War and England's conflict with the Spanish Armada. When supply ships finally returned to the colony in 1590, 3 years later than planned, they found the settlement completely abandoned. Houses stood empty, belongings were scattered, and the only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post and CRO carved into a nearby tree. Croatoan was the name of both a nearby island and a friendly native tribe. To this day, historians debate what happened to those colonists. Did they join with the Croatoan people or other local native communities? Were they lost to disease, starvation, or conflict with hostile tribes? Did they attempt to sail home and perish at sea? Some theories suggest they moved inland and gradually integrated with native populations. Archaeological digs continue to search for evidence, and genetic studies of descendants of certain native communities have yielded intriguing but inconclusive results. The mystery endures, a reminder of how precarious these early settlements were, perched at the edge of a vast and unfamiliar land, dependent on supply lines that stretched across thousands of miles of treacherous ocean. The first permanent English settlement that did survive was Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1607 along the James River. But survival came at an enormous cost. The colonists arrived during a severe drought, and they had chosen a swampy location where the water was brackish and disease-carrying mosquitoes thrived. The site had one military advantage. It was easily defensible against Spanish ships that might sail up the river. But for daily living, it was nearly disastrous. Many of the early settlers were gentlemen unaccustomed to hard labor, younger sons of aristocratic families seeking fortune in the New World. They expected to find gold or a passage to the Pacific Ocean, not the backbreaking work of building shelters, planting crops, and forging relationships with the native peoples who controlled the land around them. They arrived too late in the season to plant adequate crops, and their provisions quickly ran low. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time, the colony's population dropped from around 500 to just 60 survivors. People ate horses, dogs, rats, mice, snakes, and even shoe leather in their desperation. Archaeological evidence suggests some resorted to cannibalism, with butcher marks found on human bones in the trash heaps of the fort. One account describes a man who killed and ate his pregnant wife. When relief ships finally arrived in the spring, the survivors were literally preparing to abandon the settlement and return to England. Only the timely arrival of a new governor with supplies convinced them to stay. Jamestown's survival required extraordinary determination, luck, and eventually the cultivation of tobacco, which would become the colony's economic salvation and curse, creating wealth while establishing a plantation economy that would demand ever more land and labor. Central to Jamestown's early story was Pocahontas, whose real name was Amonute, and who also went by Matuaka. The name Pocahontas was actually a nickname meaning something like playful one or ill-behaved child. She was the daughter of Powhatan, whose given name was Wahunsenakau, the paramount chief of a powerful confederacy of Algonquian-speaking peoples that dominated the region around Jamestown. The Powhatan Confederacy included about 30 different tribes and controlled much of the Tidewater region of Virginia, an area encompassing approximately 8,000 square miles. Powhatan had inherited control of six tribes and expanded his confederacy through conquest and diplomacy to include many more. Pocahontas became famous for her association with the English, particularly the story, likely embellished or invented, of saving Captain John Smith's life by placing her head over his as her father was about to execute him. What is certain is that she served as something of a cultural ambassador, sometimes bringing messages between her father and the English, and on at least one occasion, warning the colonists of an impending attack. In 1613, during a period of hostility between the English and Powhatan, she was lured onto an English ship and taken hostage. During her captivity, she was treated relatively well, taught English and Christianity, and eventually converted, taking the name Rebecca. She married colonist John Rolfe in 1614, a union that brought about a period of peace between the English and Powhatan's people. She bore a son, Thomas, and in 1616 traveled to England with Rolfe, where she was presented at court as an example of the civilized savage, proof that native peoples could be converted and assimilated. She became a celebrity in London society. Tragically, as she was preparing to return to Virginia in 1617, she fell ill, possibly with pneumonia or tuberculosis, and died at only about 21 years old. She was buried in Gravesend, England. Her story reflects the complex, often tragic interactions between native peoples and European settlers, and the enormous cultural collisions that shaped the early colonial period. That same year Pocahontas died, something else arrived in Virginia that would forever change the trajectory of American history. In 1619, an English privateer ship called the White Lion arrived at Point Comfort, near Jamestown, carrying about 20 enslaved Africans who had been captured from a Portuguese slave ship called the São Juan Bautista. These individuals, whose names are mostly lost to history, were from the Kingdom of Ndongo in what is now Angola. They became the first documented enslaved Africans in English North America. Initially, the status of Africans in Virginia was ambiguous and complex. Some were treated as indentured servants rather than slaves, working for a set period before gaining their freedom. A few even gained their freedom, acquired land and owned property, and some themselves became slaveholders. One man, Anthony Johnson, arrived as an indentured servant, gained his freedom, acquired substantial land holdings, and even went to court to assert his ownership of a man he claimed as his slave. But over the following decades, colonial laws increasingly codified racial slavery, creating a hereditary system based on race that would enslave millions and shape American society for centuries. Laws were passed stating that children inherited the status of their mother, ensuring that slavery would pass down through generations. Other laws prohibited interracial marriage, prevented enslaved people from owning property or testifying in court, and gradually stripped away any possibility of freedom or legal rights. That moment in 1619 marked the beginning of a brutal institution that would not end until the Civil War, more than 240 years later, and whose legacy continues to shape American society to this day. Also in that same remarkable year of 1619, something else significant happened at Jamestown. The Virginia Company established the House of Burgesses, the first representative legislative assembly in the Americas, allowing colonies to have a voice in their own governance. The following year, in 1620, another group of English settlers, the Pilgrims, sailed on the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth, in what is now Massachusetts. These were religious separatists who had first fled to the Netherlands to escape persecution before deciding to establish a new community in the New World. Before even setting foot on land, 41 of the male passengers signed an agreement known as the Mayflower Compact. This compact established a form of self-government, with signers agreeing to create laws for the good of the colony and promising to abide by those laws. The document was written because the Pilgrims had landed outside the territory of their original charter, in an area where they had no legal authority. They needed to create order and prevent dissension in the group. While it wasn't a constitution or a declaration of independence, the Mayflower Compact represented an important early example of people creating their own political authority through a written agreement, a social contract among equals. It planted seeds of self-governance that would grow over the following centuries, eventually blossoming into revolutionary ideas about democracy, representation, and the consent of the governed. The idea that authority derives from the agreement of the people rather than from divine right or aristocratic privilege would echo through American history. As the colonies grew and settled into life in the New World, tensions sometimes erupted in unexpected ways. One of the darkest chapters came in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts, when a wave of accusations of witchcraft swept through the community. What began with a few young girls having fits and claiming to be tormented by witches spiraled into mass hysteria. The afflicted girls, including 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, began having seizures, throwing objects, screaming, and contorting their bodies in strange ways. When questioned, they accused several women of bewitching them. In the Puritan worldview, the devil was very real, and witches were his servants, capable of inflicting harm through supernatural means. Over the course of several months, more than 200 people were accused and 20 were executed, most by hanging. The one man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones when he refused to enter a plea. 4 others died in prison awaiting trial. The accusation spread like wildfire, with neighbors turning on neighbors. Old grudges being settled through witchcraft claims, and fear overtaking reason. Those accused included church members, respected citizens, and even a 4-year-old child. The trials were deeply flawed, accepting spectral evidence, testimony that the accused person's spirit had appeared to the witness in a dream or vision, as valid proof of witchcraft. Eventually, the governor of Massachusetts intervened, dissolving the special court and prohibiting spectral evidence. The remaining accused were released or pardoned. Years later, some of the accusers and judges publicly apologized, admitting they had been wrong. The trials have since become a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria false accusations, religious extremism, the failure of justice, and the deadly consequences of allowing fear to overwhelm reason and evidence. The phrase witch hunt entered our language as a metaphor for any campaign based on unfounded accusations and paranoia. Salem reminds us how quickly fear can overwhelm reason and how communities can turn against themselves when caught in the grip of collective panic, suspicion, and the need to find scapegoats for unexplained troubles. While colonies struggled with internal conflicts and survival, they were also drawn into competition over the continent's vast resources. One of the most valuable commodities in early colonial America was not gold or silver, but beaver pelts. Beaver fur was prized in Europe for making felt hats, which were fashionable among the middle and upper classes. The fur's unique properties, with tiny barbs that lock together when processed, made it ideal for creating waterproof, durable felt. The demand was so intense that beavers were hunted nearly to extinction in some regions. A single pelt could be worth a fortune, and the fur trade shaped relationships between European colonizers and native nations, creating alliances and fueling conflicts. The French, Dutch, and English all competed for control of beaver-rich territories, particularly around the Great Lakes, in the Hudson River Valley, and throughout the northern forests. Native peoples often found themselves in the middle of these imperial rivalries, with some nations forming partnerships with Europeans to gain access to metal tools, firearms, cloth, and other goods that transformed their lives. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, became powerful middlemen in the fur trade, controlling access to hunting grounds and trade routes. Wars erupted over beaver territory, including the Beaver Wars of the mid-1600s, brutal conflicts that reshaped the political map of northeastern North America. The fur trade also transformed native societies, introducing new technologies and goods, but also new diseases, alcohol, and dependency on European trade. European demand for beaver pelts literally changed the landscape as beaver populations crashed and the wetlands and waterways they had maintained began to disappear. The humble beaver, with its valuable pelt, helped determine which empires would rise and fall in North America, which native nations would gain power or lose it, and how the continent's ecology would be forever altered. Finally, while most people know about the famous California gold rush of 1849, fewer realize that America experienced an earlier gold rush right in North Carolina. In 1799, a 12-year-old boy named Conrad Reed found a 17-pound gold nugget in a creek on his family's farm in Cabarrus County. The story goes that Conrad was fishing when he spotted something shiny in the water. He took the massive rock home, and for 3 years, the family used it as a doorstop, not realizing what it was. In 1802, Conrad's father, John Reed, took the rock to a jeweler in Fayetteville, who recognized it as gold and offered to buy it for $3.50, an enormous sum for the time, but a tiny fraction of its actual value of about $3,600. Once word spread of Reed's discovery, gold fever struck North Carolina. By the early 1800s, prospectors were panning streams and digging mines across the Carolina Piedmont. For decades before California's discovery, North Carolina was actually the nation's leading gold producer, with finds also in Georgia, Virginia, and other southern states. Small mining towns sprang up overnight, with names like Gold Hill and Goldstone. The federal government established a branch mint in Charlotte in 1837 to process the gold being discovered, turning it into coins right there in North Carolina. Miners used simple panning techniques at first, swirling sediment in shallow pans to let the heavier gold settle to the bottom, but eventually developed more sophisticated operations with hydraulic mining and stamp mills to crush ore. This early gold rush was smaller and quieter than California's, lacking the mass migration and dramatic stories of the 49ers. But it demonstrated that the American landscape held riches that would continue to draw people westward in search of fortune. It also established mining techniques and created a generation of experienced prospectors who would later head to California when gold was discovered there. The North Carolina gold rush faded as California's boom began, but it had already written its chapter in American history, a prelude to the larger rushes that would shape the settlement of the American West. As the English colonies took root and began to flourish along the Atlantic coast, the settlers started to develop their own systems of governance and their own sense of identity. In Virginia in 1619, the same momentous year that saw the arrival of the first enslaved Africans and the landing of the Mayflower pilgrims to the north, something else remarkable happened that would shape the future of American democracy. The Virginia Company established the House of Burgesses, the first representative legislative assembly in the English colonies. The word burgess comes from the old term for a citizen of a borough or town, and these burgesses were representatives elected by the colonists themselves to meet and make laws for the colony. The first session convened in a church in Jamestown on July 30th, 1619, with 22 burgesses representing 11 plantations and settlements. They met for just 5 or 6 days, but in that short time, they established a precedent that would echo through American history. The assembly passed laws on tobacco prices, penalties for laziness, and relations with native peoples. They also petitioned the Virginia Company on various grievances. Though the British Crown and the governor retained significant power and could veto legislation, the House of Burgesses gave colonists a voice in their own governance, a taste of self-rule that they would be increasingly reluctant to give up. Over the decades, this assembly would become a training ground for political leadership, and the idea of representative government would spread to other colonies. When revolution eventually came, many of the founding fathers had cut their political teeth in colonial assemblies, just like this one, learning the arts of debate, compromise, and the crafting of legislation. The House of Burgesses planted a seed, the idea that those who lived in a place should have a say in how that place was governed, an idea that would eventually grow into a forest of democratic institutions. But while colonists were establishing their own assemblies, they were still very much part of the British Empire, and Britain had very specific ideas about what colonies were for. Many British policymakers and colonists alike believed in an economic theory called mercantilism. According to mercantilist thinking, the wealth of a nation was measured primarily by the amount of gold and silver it possessed, and the best way to accumulate that wealth was through a favorable balance of trade, exporting more than you imported. Colonies played a crucial role in this system. They were meant to provide raw materials to the mother country. Materials like timber for ships, tobacco, rice, and indigo that Britain could use or re-export for profit. In return, the colonies would buy manufactured goods from Britain, creating a closed economic loop that enriched the empire. The colonies were not supposed to develop their own manufacturing or trade freely with other nations. That would defeat the purpose. Everything was designed to benefit Britain's economy and fill Britain's treasury. The colonists, of course, had their own economic interests, and these didn't always align with what was good for Britain. They wanted to trade with whoever offered the best prices, to manufacture their own goods when it made sense, and to keep the profits of their labor. This fundamental tension between the imperial economic system and colonial self-interest would simmer for decades, occasionally boiling over into conflict, and eventually contributing to the revolutionary break with Britain. Mercantilism created an empire, but it also created the conditions for that empire's fracture. To enforce mercantilist policies, the British Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts, beginning in the 1650s and continuing through the colonial period. These acts were designed to channel colonial trade through Britain and British ships, ensuring that the mother country got its cut of the profits. Under these laws, certain colonial goods, called enumerated commodities, could only be shipped to Britain or other British colonies, not directly to foreign markets. These included valuable products like tobacco, sugar, rice, and later, naval stores like tar and turpentine. Even if a colonial merchant could get a better price in France or Spain, they were forbidden from selling there. Additionally, European goods destined for the colonies had to pass through British ports first, where they could be taxed. Ships carrying colonial goods generally had to be British-built and crewed mostly by British or colonial sailors. These regulations effectively taxed the colonists indirectly through trade restrictions rather than direct internal taxes. For many years, the colonists grumbled, but largely accepted this system, partly because enforcement was often lax, and partly because they still identified as British subjects. The Navigation Acts shaped the colonial economy, directing investment into certain crops and industries while discouraging others. They made some colonists wealthy, particularly those involved in the triangle trade or in producing enumerated goods, while frustrating others who chafed under the restrictions. The Acts also fostered a sense that British policy was designed to benefit Britain at colonial expense, a grievance that would grow louder as the 18th century progressed, and Britain began trying to enforce these laws more strictly and add new taxes on top of them. While economic and political structures were being established, English colonists were also deeply engaged in the project of converting native peoples to Christianity. In New England, Puritan missionaries established what they called praying Indian towns, also known as praying towns, where native people who converted to Christianity could live in English-style settlements, learn English customs, and be instructed in Puritan theology. The first and most famous of these was Natick, established in 1651 by missionary John Eliot near Boston. At their peak, there were 14 praying towns in Massachusetts with thousands of native residents. The converts, called praying Indians, were expected to adopt English-style clothing, housing, agriculture, and governance, essentially abandoning their traditional ways of life. In return, they received some legal protections and were supposedly safe from enslavement. John Eliot even translated the Bible into the Algonquian language, a remarkable linguistic achievement. But these communities existed in a precarious position, caught between two worlds and fully accepted by neither. English colonists often distrusted them, seeing them as potential spies or enemies. Traditional native peoples sometimes viewed them as traitors who had abandoned their culture. During King Philip's War in the 1670s, a devastating conflict between New England colonists and native peoples, the praying Indians suffered terribly. Many were rounded up and confined to bleak internment camps on harbor islands, where they suffered from cold, starvation, and disease. Their loyalty to the English was rewarded with suspicion and imprisonment. After the war, the praying towns never fully recovered. Some were disbanded, others dwindled as residents left or died. By the 18th century, most had failed or been absorbed. The experiment revealed the enormous cultural chasm between native and English societies and the painful reality that conversion often meant cultural destruction, with converts expected to completely abandon their identity rather than synthesize the two traditions. As the colonies matured through the late 1600s and into the 1700s, the institution of slavery became increasingly entrenched and racialized. In 1705, Virginia passed a comprehensive set of slave codes that hardened racial slavery in law and created a rigid racial hierarchy. These codes defined who was a slave, what rights they did not have, and what punishments could be inflicted on them. The laws stated explicitly that all servants imported who were not Christians in their native country would be slaves, with their status passing to their children, but that baptism as a Christian did not bring freedom. The codes gave masters enormous power over enslaved people, allowing them to administer brutal punishments with little fear of legal consequences. If an enslaved person died while being punished, the master could not be charged with murder. The codes also created a clear legal distinction between white and black people, prohibiting interracial marriage and sexual relations, and stripping free black people of many rights, including the right to hold office or testify against white people in court. These laws served a dual purpose. They protected the economic interests of slaveholders by ensuring that their human property remained firmly under their control. And they also worked to prevent alliances between poor whites and enslaved or free black people. By giving even the poorest white person a higher legal status than any black person, the laws created a racial caste system that helped maintain social order and prevented class-based unity among the lower classes. The Virginia slave codes became a model for other southern colonies and states, and they established legal and social structures that would persist for centuries. They transformed slavery from a labor system that had once had some ambiguity into a permanent, hereditary, race-based institution that defined people by the color of their skin and denied them their humanity under the law. With so many restrictive laws and economic regulations, it should come as no surprise that many colonists found ways around them. Smuggling became widespread throughout the colonies, as merchants dodged British trade laws to maximize their profits. Coastal towns and harbors were perfect for illicit trade, with countless coves, inlets, and rivers where ships could quietly load and unload cargo away from the eyes of customs officials. Colonial merchants smuggled in molasses from the French West Indies to make rum, avoiding the taxes they would have paid on British molasses. They traded directly with European countries, cutting out British middlemen. They underreported the value of goods, or simply failed to declare them at all. Even respectable merchants engaged in smuggling, viewing it not as crime, but as legitimate business in the face of unjust laws. Port officials were often underpaid and open to bribes. And even when they tried to enforce the law, juries of local colonists were reluctant to convict their neighbors. Smuggling became so common that it was almost normalized, part of the economic fabric of colonial life. This widespread disregard for British trade laws fostered a culture of resistance to imperial control and a belief that unjust laws need not be obeyed. It created networks of merchants and sailors who were practiced in evading authority and who had financial interests in opposing British regulation. When Britain later tried to crack down on smuggling and enforce trade laws more strictly in the 1760s, including through the use of rights of assistance that allowed customs officials to search any building for smuggled goods, the colonists reacted with outrage. They saw it as tyranny, an invasion of their rights. But from the British perspective, they were simply trying to enforce laws that had been on the books for decades. Smuggling had created a shadow economy and a culture of defiance that would contribute directly to the revolutionary movement. The tensions between Britain and its colonies were complicated further by a massive conflict that engulfed much of the world in the mid-18th century. In North America, it was called the French and Indian War, though it was part of a larger global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. The war lasted from 1754 to 1763 and pitted Britain and its colonies against France and its native allies, with both sides fighting for control of the Ohio Valley and the vast interior of the continent. The war began with skirmishes on the frontier, including a young George Washington leading Virginia militia into a disastrous engagement at Fort Necessity. It escalated into a major conflict with professional armies, naval battles, and campaigns that stretched from the forests of Pennsylvania to the walls of Quebec. Native peoples fought on both sides, though many sided with France, which had generally pursued a more cooperative relationship with native nations based on trade and alliance rather than mass settlement. The war was brutal and expensive, with thousands dying in battle, from disease or in raids on frontier settlements. Britain eventually prevailed, and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 reshaped the map of North America. France ceded nearly all of its North American territory east of the Mississippi River to Britain, as well as its claims to lands in Canada. Spain, which had allied with France, gave Florida to Britain, but received Louisiana from France as compensation. The British Empire had never been larger, but the victory came at an enormous cost. Britain had accumulated massive debts fighting the war, debts that British politicians believed the colonies should help pay since the war had been fought partly to defend them. This led directly to new taxes and policies that would outrage the colonists, including the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. The French and Indian War removed France as a power in North America, but it also removed one of the main reasons colonists felt they needed British protection. With the French threat gone, many colonists began to question why they needed British troops on their soil at all, especially when they were being asked to pay for them. The war had also given many colonists, including officers like George Washington, military experience and confidence. Ironically, Britain's greatest imperial victory set the stage for the loss of its most valuable colonies. All of this conflict and competition was driven largely by economic concerns, and at the heart of the colonial economy were natural resources. Three commodities in particular shaped the early colonial experience: beavers, cod, and tobacco. We've already discussed the beaver fur trade and how it shaped relationships and conflicts across the northern colonies and the interior. Cod was equally important, particularly for New England. The Grand Bands of Newfoundland were some of the richest fishing grounds in the world, teeming with cod that could be caught, salted, dried, and shipped across the Atlantic. Dried cod was a staple food in Catholic Europe, where meat was forbidden on Fridays and during Lent, creating enormous demand. New England fishermen built an industry around cod, and the fish became so important to the Massachusetts economy that a carved wooden cod, the sacred cod, was hung in the State House and remains there to this day. Cod fishing created wealth, built shipbuilding industries, and gave New England merchants the capital they needed to invest in other ventures, including the triangle trade. Tobacco was the economic engine of the Chesapeake colonies, particularly Virginia and Maryland. After John Rolfe successfully cultivated a hybrid strain of tobacco that was smoother and more palatable to European tastes, Virginia's economy exploded. Tobacco was literally used as currency for a time. Debts were paid in pounds of tobacco, and fines and fees were calculated in tobacco. The crop was so profitable that colonists grew it everywhere, even in the streets of Jamestown. But tobacco quickly exhausted the soil, requiring ever more land, which drove expansion into native territories and fueled conflict. It also created a demand for labor that would be filled increasingly by enslaved Africans as the 17th century progressed. These three commodities, beaver pelts from the forests, cod from the sea, and tobacco from the fields, built the colonial economy and funded the growth of colonial society. They connected the colonies to global trade networks and made fortunes for some, while demanding the labor and displacement of many others. As the 18th century progressed and colonial society became more established, colonists were exposed to new ideas flowing from Europe, particularly from the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers emphasized reason, science, and the power of human intellect to understand and improve the world. Philosophers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu wrote about natural rights, the social contract, and the separation of powers in government. John Locke argued that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that governments derived their legitimate authority from the consent of the governed. If a government violated those natural rights, the people had the right to alter or abolish it. These were revolutionary ideas, challenging the traditional notions of divine right monarchy and absolute authority. Books and pamphlets circulating these ideas made their way across the Atlantic and were eagerly read by educated colonists. Colonial newspapers reprinted essays by Enlightenment thinkers. Young men at colleges like Harvard, Yale, and the College of William and Mary studied these works and debated their implications. The Enlightenment gave colonists an intellectual framework for understanding their grievances against Britain and for imagining an alternative political order. When Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he was drawing directly on Enlightenment philosophy. particularly Locke's ideas. When the founders designed a government with separation of powers, checks and balances, and a Bill of Rights, they were putting Enlightenment principles into practice. These ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and limited government would not only inspire the American Revolution, but would continue to shape American political thought and influence revolutionary movements around the world for generations to come. But colonial life wasn't all high-minded philosophy and political theory. The colonies, particularly the port cities, had a rougher, more adventurous side. Cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston were bustling, diverse, sometimes dangerous places where sailors, merchants, enslaved people, indentured servants, and free artisans mixed together. And these cities were notorious for their connections to piracy. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, known as the Golden Age of piracy, pirates prowled the Atlantic and Caribbean, attacking merchant ships, Spanish treasure fleets, and even entire towns. Some of the most famous pirates in history operated during this era, including Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach. Blackbeard was a terrifying figure, tall and imposing, with a long black beard that he reportedly braided and tied with ribbons. In battle, he would stick slow-burning fuses under his hat so that smoke wreathed his head, making him look demonic. In 1718, Blackbeard sailed his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, into the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina, and blockaded the city for nearly a week. He captured several ships and took prominent hostages, including a member of the Colonial Council. His demand was not for gold or jewels, but for medicine, specifically a chest of medical supplies for his crew, many of whom were suffering from disease. The terrified city complied, and Blackbeard sailed away, eventually meeting his end later that year in a battle with Royal Navy forces off the coast of North Carolina. Pirates like Blackbeard were both criminals and, in some ways, entrepreneurs operating outside the law. Many pirates had started as privateers, sailors commissioned by governments to attack enemy ships during wartime, but who turned to piracy when the wars ended and they needed income. Colonial authorities had a complicated relationship with pirates. Officially, they condemned piracy and hanged captured pirates. But unofficially, many merchants and even some colonial governors traded with pirates, buying the stolen goods at low prices and selling them supplies. Pirates brought Spanish silver and exotic goods into colonial ports, stimulating local economies. Some retired pirates settled in colonial towns and became respectable citizens. The notorious Captain William Kidd, for example, was a wealthy merchant and privateer who lived in New York before his controversial turn to piracy and eventual execution in London. The pirate era eventually ended as navies cracked down and colonial governments could no longer afford to turn a blind eye. But for a time, pirates were a colorful, dangerous part of colonial life, symbols of the rough, unruly, and opportunistic spirit of the age. By the 1770s, tensions between Great Britain and its American colonies had reached a breaking point. Years of new taxes, trade restrictions, and what colonists saw as violations of their rights had created a powder keg of resentment and anger. British troops had been stationed in Boston to maintain order, leading to clashes like the Boston Massacre in 1770, where soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 saw colonists dump hundreds of chests of British tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act. Britain responded with punitive measures the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port and curtailing Massachusetts' self-government. Colonial militias began training and stockpiling weapons. Both sides were preparing for conflict, though many still hoped for reconciliation. That fragile hope shattered in the early morning hours of April 19th, 1775, when the opening shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. British General Thomas Gage had received orders to seize military supplies that colonial militias had stored in Concord and to arrest rebel leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. On the night of April 18th, about 700 British soldiers marched out of Boston toward Concord. But the colonists had an intelligence network, and riders including Paul Revere and William Dawes raced ahead to warn the countryside that the British were coming. By the time the British reached Lexington Green at dawn, about 70 colonial militiamen were assembled to confront them. The British commander ordered the militia to disperse. Someone fired a shot. To this day, no one knows which side fired first, whether it was a British soldier, a militiaman, or perhaps an accidental discharge. But that single shot, immortalized as the shot heard round the world, sparked a battle. The British fired volleys into the militia, killing 8 and wounding 10. The Redcoats then marched on to Concord, where they found and destroyed some military supplies. But by now, militiamen were streaming in from surrounding towns, hundreds and then thousands of them. At the North Bridge in Concord, militia engaged the British in a fierce firefight. The British began their march back to Boston, and that march became a nightmare. Colonial militiamen lined the road, firing from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings, using frontier fighting tactics against soldiers trained for European-style warfare. The British retreat became a running battle, with casualties mounting. By the time the exhausted Redcoats reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties, while colonial forces had lost fewer than 100. The war had begun. There would be no turning back now. The colonists and the British Empire were at war. In the wake of Lexington and Concord, colonial militias laid siege to Boston, trapping the British Army in the city. Colonial leaders realized they needed to coordinate their efforts to transform scattered militias into a unified fighting force. The Second Continental Congress, which had convened in Philadelphia in May 1775, took on this task. The delegates came from 12 of the 13 colonies, with Georgia joining later. They were lawyers, merchants, planters, men of property and education, but they were about to become revolutionaries. In June 1775, the Congress took the momentous step of creating the Continental Army, bringing together militia forces from different colonies under a single command. They needed a commander-in-chief, someone with military experience, leadership ability, and the respect of all the colonies. The choice fell on George Washington of Virginia. Washington was 43 years old, a wealthy planter and veteran of the French and Indian War. He was tall, imposing, and carried himself with natural authority. He was from the South, which was important politically, as it helped ensure that the fight wouldn't be seen as just a New England rebellion. Washington accepted the command with humility, refusing to take a salary and asking only that his expenses be covered. He rode north to Massachusetts to take command of the army besieging Boston. Washington would lead the Continental Army for the entire 8 years of the war, through devastating defeats and remarkable victories, through winters when his soldiers went barefoot in the snow, and times when the army nearly dissolved for lack of pay. His leadership, his steadiness under pressure, and his unwavering commitment to the cause would be essential to American victory. He became the indispensable man of the Revolution, and his service would make him the obvious choice as the first president of the new nation. As the war raged, with battles fought from Massachusetts to Georgia, the Continental Congress grappled with a fundamental question. What exactly were they fighting for? At first, many colonists hoped for reconciliation with Britain, for a return to the way things had been before the new taxes and restrictions. But as the war continued and British actions became harsher, including the burning of towns and the use of German mercenaries called Hessians, sentiment shifted toward full independence. In June 1776, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution stating that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. The committee included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, a 33-year-old lawyer and planter from Virginia, known for his elegant writing, was chosen to draft the document. He worked in a rented room in Philadelphia, drawing on Enlightenment philosophy, particularly John Locke's ideas about natural rights, and on his own understanding of the colonists' grievances. The document he produced was remarkable, a powerful statement of universal principles, combined with a specific indictment of King George III. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," Jefferson wrote, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The declaration went on to list the king's offenses and to declare that the colonies were now free and independent states. The Congress debated the declaration, making some changes, most notably removing Jefferson's passage condemning slavery, which Southern delegates refused to accept. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. Church bells rang out across Philadelphia. The document was printed and distributed, read aloud in town squares and to assembled troops. July 4th became the birthday of a new nation, though the war to secure that independence was far from over. The Declaration transformed the conflict from a rebellion over taxes into a war for fundamental human rights and self-determination, and it articulated ideals that would inspire revolutionary movements around the world for centuries to come. But declaring independence and actually achieving it were two very different things. The Americans faced the most powerful military in the world, the British Army and Navy, with professional soldiers, modern weapons, and vast resources. The Continental Army, by contrast, was perpetually short of everything: weapons, ammunition, uniforms, food, money, and often men, as militia terms expired and soldiers went home. Washington suffered a series of defeats in 1776, losing New York City and retreating across New Jersey. By December, the army was on the verge of disintegration. Washington took a desperate gamble, crossing the icy Delaware River on Christmas night and attacking a garrison of Hessian soldiers at Trenton, New Jersey. The surprise victory provided a much-needed morale boost, but the war continued to go poorly. The British captured Philadelphia in 1777, forcing Congress to flee. Then came a turning point. In October 1777, American forces under General Horatio Gates surrounded and defeated a British army at Saratoga, New York. The Battle of Saratoga is often called the turning point of the Revolution, not because it was the largest battle or caused the most casualties, but because of its diplomatic consequences. The victory proved to European powers, particularly France, that the Americans could actually win. France had been watching the conflict with interest, still bitter about its losses in the 7 Years' War, and eager to weaken Britain. But the French were hesitant to support what looked like a losing cause. Saratoga changed the calculation. In February 1778, France formally allied with the United States, providing military support, supplies, money, and most importantly, the French Navy, which could challenge British naval supremacy. French officers, soldiers, and ships would play crucial roles in the war's final campaigns. Spain and the Netherlands also entered the war against Britain, forcing the British to defend their interests around the globe, not just in North America. Saratoga transformed the American Revolution from a colonial rebellion into a world war, and that transformation made American victory possible. The alliance with France brought hope, but it didn't end the suffering. The winter of 1777 to 1778 would become legendary as one of the darkest periods of the war. The Continental Army, numbering around 12,000 men, went into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, about 20 miles northwest of British-occupied Philadelphia. It should have been a time to rest and recover, but it became a nightmare of deprivation. The soldiers lacked adequate clothing, with many having no shoes or coats despite the bitter cold. They lacked food, going days with little more than fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked over fires. They lacked shelter, living in crude log huts that provided little protection from the elements. Disease swept through the camp. Typhus, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia, killing an estimated 2,000 men that winter. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet and left bloody footprints in the snow. Some deserted, unable to endure any longer. Washington pleaded with Congress and the states for supplies, for money, for anything to help his suffering army. Slowly, conditions improved as spring approached. And during that terrible winter, something important happened. A Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge. Von Steuben was a veteran of the elite Prussian army, one of the best trained military forces in Europe. He had been recruited by Benjamin Franklin in Paris and sent to help the Americans. Von Steuben took charge of training the Continental Army, drilling the soldiers in European military tactics, teaching them how to march in formation, load and fire their muskets more efficiently, and use bayonets in close combat. He worked tirelessly, demonstrating the movements himself despite the language barrier, since he spoke little English and had to work through translators. He created a training manual, the regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, which became the Army's standard drill manual. By the time the Army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, it was transformed. The ragged collection of militia and volunteers had become a professional fighting force, capable of standing toe-to-toe with British regulars. Valley Forge became a symbol of perseverance, of suffering endured for a greater cause, and a testament to Washington's leadership and the dedication of the soldiers who stayed when they could have gone home. The war continued for 3 more years after Valley Forge, with major fighting shifting to the southern colonies. The British captured Savannah and Charleston and won victories in the Carolinas. But American forces under generals like Nathanael Greene fought a brilliant campaign of attrition, avoiding major battles while wearing down British forces with quick strikes and guerrilla tactics. And the French alliance began to pay dividends. In 1781, the war reached its climax at Yorktown, Virginia. British General Lord Cornwallis had marched his army to Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the York River, planning to establish a naval base and resupply his forces. But the situation quickly turned disastrous for the British. Washington, in New York with the main Continental Army, learned of Cornwallis's position and made a bold decision. He would march south and trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. Simultaneously, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse would sail north from the Caribbean to cut off any British escape by sea. The plan required precise coordination and a bit of luck. It worked. Washington marched his army and French forces under General Rochambeau south in a rapid, secret movement. They arrived at Yorktown in late September and laid siege to the British positions. De Grasse's fleet defeated a British naval force in the Battle of the Chesapeake, ensuring that the Royal Navy could not evacuate or resupply Cornwallis. Trapped between the American and French armies on land and the French fleet at sea, with no hope of relief, Cornwallis found his position hopeless. On October 19, 1781, after several weeks of siege and bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army of more than 7,000 men. The British band reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting choice for an event that seemed to reverse the natural order, with a collection of rebellious colonists defeating the British Empire. Yorktown effectively ended major fighting in the Revolutionary War. Though the war would not officially end for another 2 years, and though British forces still occupied New York and other cities, everyone knew that Britain had lost. There would be no more major campaigns. The Americans, with essential help from France, Spain, and the Netherlands, had won their independence. Yorktown brought military victory, but the new nation still needed formal recognition and a peace treaty. Negotiations took place in Paris and dragged on for nearly 2 years. The American delegation included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, all skilled diplomats. The British were in no hurry, hoping the alliance between America and France might fracture, but the Americans negotiated skillfully, sometimes playing Britain and France against each other. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the Revolutionary War. The treaty recognized American independence and granted the new United States territory reaching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from the Great Lakes to the Spanish colony of Florida in the south. It was an enormous territory, far larger than the 13 original colonies, and it contained the potential for westward expansion that would define the nation's future. Britain also agreed to withdraw its troops from American soil, though this would take longer than promised, with some British forts remaining occupied, into the 1790s. The treaty was generous to the United States, perhaps because Britain wanted to establish good relations with its former colonies and drive a wedge between America and France. For native peoples living in the territory now claimed by the United States, the treaty was a disaster, as neither Britain nor the Americans consulted them, and their lands were essentially given away without their consent. But for the Americans, the Treaty of Paris was the culmination of 8 years of struggle, a formal acknowledgement that they were now a free and independent nation, recognized by the powers of Europe. But winning independence was only the first challenge. Now the Americans had to figure out how to govern themselves. During the war, the Continental Congress had drafted the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, which went into effect in 1781. The Articles created a national government, but an extraordinarily weak one. The founders had just fought a war against what they saw as tyrannical central authority, and they were deeply suspicious of concentrated power. So they created a government that had almost no power at all. Under the Articles, there was a Congress, with each state having one vote, but there was no president, no national judiciary, and no ability to enforce laws. Congress could not tax. It could only request money from the states, which often ignored the requests. It could not regulate trade between states or with foreign nations. It could not raise an army without asking the states to provide troops. Major decisions required the agreement of 9 of the 13 states, and any amendment to the Articles required unanimous consent, which proved impossible to achieve. The government under the Articles accomplished some important things, including winning the war and negotiating the Treaty of Paris, and it passed the Northwest Ordinance, which established a process for admitting new states from the Western territories. But overall, the Articles created a government so weak that it could barely function. The states acted almost like independent countries, printing their own money, charging tariffs on goods from other states, and pursuing their own foreign policies. The national government fell deeply into debt and had no way to pay it off. Soldiers who had fought in the war went unpaid. Foreign nations refused to negotiate seriously with a government that seemed unable to enforce its agreements. By the mid-1780s, many American leaders believed the country was on the verge of collapse. The crisis came to a head with Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising that erupted in western Massachusetts in 1786 and 1787. The rebellion was led by Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, and it was driven by economic desperation. Farmers in western Massachusetts were struggling with heavy debts and high taxes imposed by the state government, which was controlled by wealthy merchants and creditors in Boston. When farmers couldn't pay their debts, courts foreclosed on their farms and sometimes sent them to debtors' prison. The farmers petitioned the state government for relief, for paper money that would make debts easier to pay, for lower taxes, for changes to the foreclosure laws. The government ignored them. In frustration, thousands of farmers took up arms, many of them veterans of the Revolution, and began shutting down courthouses to prevent foreclosure proceedings. They believed they were defending their rights and property, just as they had during the Revolution. Daniel Shays led a force that attempted to seize a federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, in January 1787, hoping to arm a larger rebellion. They were repulsed by militia artillery, and the rebellion gradually fell apart. Shays and other leaders fled, though most were eventually pardoned. The rebellion itself was not particularly large or long-lasting, but its impact on American politics was enormous. It terrified wealthy elites and national leaders who saw it as evidence that the country was descending into anarchy and mob rule. George Washington, in retirement at Mount Vernon, wrote alarmed letters about the rebellion, fearing that everything they had fought for was unraveling. Shays's rebellion provided powerful ammunition for those who had been arguing that the Articles of Confederation were insufficient, that the country needed a stronger central government capable of maintaining order, enforcing laws, and commanding respect. The rebellion helped spur calls for a convention to revise the Articles, a convention that would instead produce an entirely new constitution. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states, all except Rhode Island, gathered in Philadelphia for what became known as the Constitutional Convention. They met in the same building, Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. The stated purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but it quickly became clear that many delegates had more ambitious plans. Led by figures like James Madison of Virginia and Alexander Hamilton of New York, they set out to create an entirely new framework of government. The convention met in secret, with windows closed and guards at the doors, to allow for frank debate without outside pressure. George Washington presided over the convention, lending his prestige and authority to the proceedings. Over 4 months of intense debate, through the sweltering Philadelphia summer, the delegates hammered out a new constitution. They grappled with fundamental questions. How should states be represented in the national legislature? How should the president be chosen? How much power should the federal government have versus the states? How could they prevent tyranny while creating a government strong enough to be effective? The result was a constitution that created 3 branches of government with checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. The legislative branch, Congress, would be divided into 2 houses: the Senate, with equal representation for each state, and the House of Representatives, with representation based on population. The executive branch would be headed by a president, chosen by an electoral college, rather than by direct popular vote. The judicial branch would consist of federal courts, culminating in a Supreme Court. The Constitution gave the federal government significant powers, including the ability to tax, regulate interstate and foreign commerce, and raise armies. But it also limited those powers through enumeration, listing specific things Congress could do, and through a system of checks and balances, ensuring that each branch could constrain the others. The Constitution was a bundle of compromises, including the infamous 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation, giving extra political power to slave states while denying the humanity of enslaved people. On September 17, 1787, 39 of the remaining delegates signed the Finnish Constitution. It would still need to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states before taking effect, a process that would require another hard-fought campaign of persuasion and debate. But the framework was in place. The United States had created a new form of government, one that balanced federal and state power, separated powers among 3 branches, and established a system of checks and balances designed to prevent tyranny while enabling effective governance. It was an experiment, untested and uncertain, but it would prove to be one of the most influential and enduring constitutional systems in history.